The first time I heard my aunt's voice echo across the courtroom, my stomach twisted into knots. "Your Honor, I present Exhibit A, my itemized invoice for raising my niece after her mother's untimely death." A thick manila folder slid across the polished oak table. The sound, it was sharp, final, like a gavel striking. I sat frozen, my palms damp against the wooden bench, watching Judge Hollis adjust his glasses. He flipped open the file, scanning neat lines of charges: emotional labor, laundry detergent, birthday cake expenses. Then he paused, his brow furrowing. "Mrs. Harrison, where is the mention of the $280,000 in survivor benefits?" I was 25 the day I sat in that courtroom, but the moment my aunt's voice filled the air, I felt 10 years old again, small, uncertain, desperate to prove I belonged. To understand how I got there, you have to know what my life looked like before everything fell apart. Every morning, I still wake up before dawn. It's a habit my mother drilled into me before cancer took her. "Mornings are where the world whispers," she used to say, brushing my hair back as the kettle hissed on our chipped stovetop. Now, in my small apartment downtown, the whisper is different: the hum of traffic, the rattle of pipes. I sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that always tastes a little burnt, and I spread out my casebooks. Law school taught me that discipline is less about brilliance and more about showing up, page after page, until the words make sense. The walls of my apartment are thin. Some mornings I hear the neighbor's radio crackling out old jazz tunes. Other mornings, it's the heavy boots of the construction crew downstairs. But in those in-between hours, when the sun is still deciding whether to rise, I feel closest to my mother. There's a photograph taped above my desk, her in her librarian's cardigan, glasses low on her nose, smiling like she knew something nobody else did. That picture has followed me from dorm to dorm, apartment to apartment, like a quiet anchor. Growing up, Aunt Katherine's house felt nothing like my mother's. My mother's world had been filled with softness: shelves of library books, the faint lavender scent of fabric softener, music drifting from the kitchen radio. Aunt Katherine's house, by contrast, was sharp edges and constant noise. She wasn't cruel in the obvious ways. She didn't hit or scream. But her love always had a price tag attached. If she bought me a dress for school, she made sure everyone at church knew she'd sacrificed for it. If she took me to the doctor, she'd sigh and tell her friends how exhausting it was to be saddled with a child who wasn't even hers. By the time I was 15, I'd learned to shrink myself. I washed my own clothes, cooked simple meals, and stayed quiet in the corner while she and her husband, Paul, argued about bills or vacations they never took. Still, I clung to small things. The back porch swing where I'd read books from the library. The sound of crickets on humid summer nights. The faint taste of freedom when I filled out my first college application on her old desktop computer. People often told me how lucky I was to have an aunt step in. And in some ways, I was. She kept a roof over my head. She signed the school forms. She fed me, though usually with a running commentary on how much groceries cost. But gratitude can be a heavy chain. I wore it around my neck for years, convinced that every smile, every holiday meal, every graduation card was something I owed her repayment for. That's the thing about invisible debts: they grow in the shadows, gathering interest you don't realize until someone like Aunt Katherine drags you into a courtroom with a folder full of invoices. As I sat in that apartment years later, coffee cooling beside me, I thought about the strange balance of my life. On one hand, I was building something for myself: law school, internships, long nights at the library. On the other, I was always carrying the weight of her voice in the back of my mind, reminding me I would never have made it without her. At the time, I didn't know just how far she'd take that belief. I was 9 when my mother's illness took her from me. One night she was tucking me into bed, promising that she'd be there for my spelling bee, and 2 weeks later, she was gone. The days after felt like being tossed into a storm without a map. Aunt Katherine stepped in with the authority of someone who had always been waiting for her moment. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she told me, placing a stiff hand on my shoulder at the funeral. "You'll be with us now. We'll take good care of you." She said it loud enough for the pastor, the neighbors, and my mother's colleagues from the library to hear. Everyone nodded approvingly, grateful that the orphan child had someone to take her in. I clung to that promise like a lifeline. It was small at first. A comment slipped into casual conversation. "You know, groceries aren't free," she muttered one evening as I poured myself a second glass of milk. I froze, glass trembling in my hand. "I'm sorry," I whispered. She sighed, long and theatrical. "It's fine. Just, someday you'll understand what it costs to raise a child. Nothing comes without sacrifice." I didn't know it then, but that was the first seed. By middle school, the comments became routine. "I spent all afternoon driving you to soccer practice. Gas isn't cheap. That dress for the dance. $50. I expect you to take care of it. Remember who paid for that dentist visit, young lady." Each remark was a tiny scratch on the surface of my childhood, carving out the idea that my very existence was an expense. I carried those scratches like tally marks across my heart. When report cards came home, I studied harder than anyone else, desperate to show her the investment wasn't wasted. Straight A's weren't just grades, they were receipts, proof I was worth the what I didn't know then, and wouldn't discover until years later, was that she was collecting money from the government each month in my name. Survivor benefits meant to give me stability, to cushion the loss of a parent. She never mentioned it. Not once. Looking back, it explains the new car she bought when I turned 12, the remodeling of the kitchen, the trips she and Uncle Paul took for their marriage. All the while, I believed she was draining her savings to keep me clothed and fed. The betrayal didn't happen all at once. It built slowly, like water behind a dam. But the crack came the summer before I left for college. I'd earned a partial scholarship. Not full, but enough that I felt proud. I came home waving the acceptance letter, heart bursting, ready to share the good news. Aunt Katherine's reaction was not what I expected. She skimmed the letter, pursed her lips, and set it down on the counter. "Well," she said flatly, "I suppose that's something. But don't think this erases the debt you owe me." My stomach dropped. "Debt?" She crossed her arms. 14 years of food, shelter, clothes, school trips. "You think all that was free? You'll need to pay me back one day." Her words landed like a slap. My chest tightened, my hands shook. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized she hadn't raised me out of love. She had raised me with a ledger. I didn't argue. At 18, with a single suitcase and a half-tuition scholarship, I didn't have the strength. I left quietly for college, promising myself I'd never owe her another thing. But silence doesn't erase wounds. Every holiday visit, every phone call, she slipped in reminders. "Don't forget who gave you a roof. You'll pay me back someday, you'll see." I thought maybe once I graduated law school, she'd let it go. Maybe it was just her way of holding on to control. But then came the letter from her lawyer, the one summoning me to court over a supposed $30,000 bill. Sitting in that courtroom, I realized this wasn't just about money. It was about rewriting history. About her standing in front of strangers and painting herself as the martyr who had sacrificed everything for an ungrateful child. The betrayal wasn't just that she wanted $30,000. It was that she wanted to erase the truth of my childhood, to turn my grief into her currency. And that, I couldn't allow. The courtroom smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, the kind of scent that clung to government buildings. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded tightly in my lap, while Aunt Katherine stood at the other side with her lawyer, chin lifted as though she were about to accept an award. "Your Honor," she began, "raising a child is no small expense. My husband and I sacrificed vacations, savings, and years of our lives to provide for my niece. We believe $30,000 is a fair reimbursement." She slid the manila folder across the table. The sound echoed like a thunderclap in my ears. Judge Hollis adjusted his glasses and opened the file. I watched his eyes scan the neat columns. Groceries, $12,450 school supplies, $3,200 birthday cake expenses, $1,080 emotional labor, $8,000. My throat burned. Emotional labor. She had turned my childhood into a spreadsheet. The judge looked up, expression unreadable. "Mrs. Harrison," he said slowly, "this is quite detailed. But before we proceed, perhaps you could explain why there's no mention here of the survivor benefits you collected in Miss Martinez's name." For the first time all morning, Aunt Katherine blinked. "Excuse me." "The Social Security benefits," Judge Hollis repeated. "Our records show you received approximately $280,000 over the years. Money meant specifically for her care. Yet I see no acknowledgement of that in your accounting." Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line. "That money was household support. We used it for bills. Utilities. It barely covered half of what she cost us." I stared at her, my nails digging crescents into my palms. Half. She'd bought a new car, remodeled the kitchen, taken weekend trips to the coast, all while reminding me to be grateful for hand-me-down shoes. The judge's gaze sharpened. "Mrs. Harrison, are you asking this court to believe that $280,000 wasn't sufficient to cover a child's upbringing? And that, despite that support, you are now owed an additional $30,000? Silence stretched across the courtroom. Katherine shifted her weight, trying to regain her composure. "Yes, Your Honor," she said at last, voice tight. "Because no amount of government assistance can truly cover the sacrifice of raising someone else's child." Her words were sharp enough to cut. I felt them slice through me, someone else's child. When court recessed for lunch, I stepped outside into the September air. The city buzzed around me, horns blaring, heels clicking against the sidewalk, but I felt wrapped in a strange bubble of stillness. I sat on the courthouse steps, my bag at my feet, my hands trembling in my lap. For years, I had carried her words like invisible chains. "You owe me. You cost me. You'll pay me back." And now, hearing her say it under oath, in front of strangers, stripped away whatever illusions I had left. She hadn't raised me out of love. She had raised me as an investment. But the judge's question kept replaying in my head, the survivor benefits. The truth was out there now, floating in the open air, undeniable. For the first time, I wasn't just a scared child shrinking under her sighs and reminders. I was an adult. A law student. Someone who could finally fight back. As I looked back at the courthouse doors, I felt something shift inside me, not anger exactly, but a steady, burning clarity. She thought she could reduce me to a ledger. She thought $30,000 would seal the story of my childhood. But I had something she didn't, the truth. That night after the first hearing, I couldn't sleep. The ceiling above my bed was cracked faintly, a spiderweb branching from one corner. I traced it with my eyes, again and again, as the red glow of my alarm clock shifted from midnight to 2 a.m., then to 3. My chest felt heavy, as if someone had stacked books inside it, one after another, until breathing took effort. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the manila folder sliding across the courtroom table. Birthday cake expenses. Emotional labor. Words that turn childhood memories into transactions. I got up and paced the narrow length of my apartment. The hardwood floor creaked under my bare feet. My textbooks lay scattered across the desk, open to pages I hadn't read. I pressed my palms into the desk, leaned forward, and whispered to myself, "This can't be how the story ends." In the stillness, I thought of my mother. I remembered how she'd sit beside me in the library's children's section, her cardigan sleeves rolled to her elbows, whispering lines of poetry while I sounded out words. Her voice always carried patience, even when her body was failing. "You are not a burden, Mija," she told me once, when I'd apologized for being sick myself, for missing school to stay by her hospital bed. "You are my reason." The memory hit me like a wave. My aunt's voice in court, someone else's child, clashed with my mother's words, my reason. The truth lived somewhere between those voices. And it was up to me to decide which one would define me. By 4 a.m., I was sitting at my desk, stacks of paper spread out like a battlefield. Old school records, college applications, even faded photographs, all the fragments of my life I had carried with me in boxes and folders. I pulled out the acceptance letter from college, the one I'd once waved proudly in front of Katherine. The ink was smudged at the edges from the day my hands had shaken reading it. Her words echoed in my head, "This doesn't erase the debt you owe me." But what if the debt was hers? What if the real record wasn't in her invoices but in the survivor benefits she had pocketed, the lies she had polished and presented as sacrifice? The idea lit something in me, a flame that burned through the exhaustion, through the years of shrinking myself. I didn't want vengeance for its own sake. What I wanted was truth. To stand in a room where her voice had always drowned out mine, and finally be heard. In the bottom of the box, folded and yellowing, I found one of my mother's letters. She had written it when she was already sick, her handwriting shaky but still elegant. "If you're reading this, it means I'm not there. But remember, love is not a ledger. Nobody owes for it, nobody collects. Love is the only thing that multiplies the more you give it." I pressed the paper to my chest. For years, Aunt Katherine had taught me to live like I was in debt. But here, in my mother's words, was permission to be free. As dawn lightened the edges of the blinds, I stopped pacing. I sat down, pulled my laptop toward me, and opened a blank document. Title: Exhibit B. The truth. If Katherine wanted to present her carefully itemized version of my childhood, then I would present mine. Not just memories, but documents, records, photographs, financial statements, every piece of evidence that told the real story. I didn't know yet how hard it would be, how many late nights and false starts were ahead. But for the first time, I felt something stronger than fear. Resolve. She had written me into her story as a debt. Now, I would write myself back as a truth. The first thing I learned about truth is that it doesn't hand itself over neatly. You have to dig for it. And digging hurts. By day, I attended lectures and worked at the campus law clinic. By night, I became my own investigator. My desk turned into a fortress of files, bank statements, Social Security records, old report cards, photographs that carried more weight than I ever realized. It started with a call to Social Security. My voice shook as I confirmed what the judge had suggested. Yes, survivor benefits had been issued monthly in my name for 14 years. Yes, the total exceeded $280,000. The woman on the phone spoke kindly, unaware her words were chiseling through years of silence. "That money was for your care," she explained. "For you. Not anyone else." I thanked her, hung up, and sat very still in my chair. For so long, I'd thought I owed Katherine everything. But on paper, she had owed me. When I requested copies of the disbursement records, Katherine's lawyer fought to block them. Irrelevant to the case at hand, he argued in pretrial motions. I remember sitting in the gallery that day, listening to the back and forth. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The judge finally leaned forward and said, "Counsel, if your client intends to claim reimbursement, the court must consider all funds already received for that purpose. Motion denied. It was a small victory, but it felt like oxygen rushing back into my lungs. Still, not every night burned with clarity. Some nights, exhaustion hollowed me out. I'd stare at the stacks of paper, thinking, what if the judge doesn't care? What if Katherine wins anyway? In those moments, her voice from my teenage years echoed like a curse. You'll never be enough. You'll always owe me. I remember one night calling my best friend, Clara. She listened quietly as I rambled, words spilling too fast. What if this just makes me look ungrateful? I whispered. What if people believe her version? Clara's voice was steady. Then you show them the truth, not for them, but for you. You've lived under her shadow long enough. I reached out to relatives, cousins, and uncle, hoping for statements about how Katherine had spent those years. Most responded with silence. A few offered polite excuses. One cousin finally said, "Look, she kept a roof over your head. Maybe just let it go." The words stung more than I expected. Maybe they believed her narrative. Maybe, in their eyes, I was the ungrateful niece dragging family business into court. I cried that night, quietly, pressing my face into a pillow so the neighbors wouldn't hear. But when the tears dried, I looked again at my mother's letter. Love is not a ledger. That sentence became my anchor. At the next hearing, Katherine's lawyer tried to paint me as opportunistic. She is a law student, Your Honor, he said smoothly. She sees this as a chance to practice theatrics. This case is not about truth, it's about resentment. I clenched my jaw so hard it ached. My hands wanted to ball into fists, but I kept them still on the table. The judge glanced at me. For a moment, the room was silent except for the scratch of someone's pen in the gallery. "Miss Martinez," Judge Hollis said, "do you have evidence that directly contradicts the plaintiff's claims?" My voice shook, but I stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I'll be submitting records of survivor benefits collected in my name, as well as statements showing how those funds were spent." Katherine's face turned red, her lips twitching like she wanted to interrupt. But the judge nodded. "Proceed." It wasn't triumph, not yet. But it was survival. The breakthrough came when I found an old box of receipts shoved in the back of a filing cabinet at Aunt Katherine's house. I hadn't gone there, I couldn't bear to, but Paul, her husband, called me one evening. "I don't like how she's handling this," he muttered over the phone. "I've got paperwork. Might help you." The next day, he handed me a worn shoebox, eyes darting nervously like he was handing off contraband. Inside were receipts, hotel stays, spa visits, even a new refrigerator, all purchased during the years she claimed she was drowning under the cost of raising me. Many were paid with the survivor benefit card. When I laid them out on my desk, my hands shook with something that felt dangerously close to vindication. This wasn't just my word against hers anymore. This was evidence. Even with the documents piling up, I knew the courtroom wasn't predictable. People could twist facts, charm juries, spin narratives. But what Katherine couldn't erase anymore was that I had found my voice. Some nights I still lay awake, heart hammering, terrified I'd falter under her gaze. But when that fear rose, I'd hear my mother's voice again. "You are not a burden. You are my reason." The words steadied me. Katherine wanted to put a price on my childhood. I would show the court, and myself, that its value couldn't be reduced to dollars on a page. The courtroom was hushed when Judge Hollis called the session back to order. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above, the shuffle of papers, the squeak of leather shoes against the polished floor. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure the bailiff could hear it. Aunt Katherine sat tall, her pearl necklace glinting beneath the overhead lights. She wore the expression of someone certain she had already won. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering something that made her lips twitch in a smile. But I wasn't the child she had raised to shrink anymore. I stood, a folder of my own in hand. Your Honor, I began, forcing my voice to steady. In response to the plaintiff's claim, I submit Exhibit B, documentation of Social Security survivor benefits issued in my name, totaling $280,000. The bailiff carried the folder forward. The judge flipped it open, his brows lifting slightly as he scanned the neatly clipped pages. I took a breath, continued. Additionally, I submit receipts and bank statements showing how those funds were spent, not on my food, clothing, or school expenses as intended, but on household renovations, spa visits, vacations, and personal luxury items. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The sound filled me with equal parts dread and release. Katherine stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the table. That's a lie, she spat. Mrs. Harrison, Judge Hollis said firmly, you'll have your turn. I held the last page up. My voice trembled, but I didn't stop. This is my mother's letter, written before her passing. She entrusted me with the truth that love is not a debt. These funds were meant to care for me, not to be turned into leverage against me. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't just listening to her. They were listening to me. The silence afterward was suffocating. Katherine's lawyer flipped frantically through his notes, muttering, "We'll contest authenticity," but his voice faltered as the judge raised a hand. Katherine leaned forward, her face red. I took her in when no one else would. I gave her a home, food, everything she needed. And this is how she repays me. Her words cracked, shrill in the still room. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. I forced myself to meet her eyes. You didn't give me those things, Aunt Katherine. My mother did. Through the benefits you collected in my name. You weren't sacrificing, you were spending. Her mouth opened and closed, like she was searching for a retort. But nothing came. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. Mrs. Harrison, these records are clear. Not only were you adequately provided with funds to raise your niece, but your expenditures indicate personal use. Your claim of $30,000 owed is unfounded. A murmur of agreement rippled through the benches. Katherine sank back in her chair, her pearl necklace suddenly looking like a chain. Judge Hollis adjusted his glasses. This court not only dismisses the plaintiff's claim but will be referring this matter to the Social Security Administration for further review. Katherine gasped. You can't, but the gavel struck once, sharp and final. Court is adjourned. The sound echoed through me like thunder rolling across an open sky. I gathered my papers slowly, deliberately, while Katherine sat frozen. Her lawyer tried to speak to her, but she shoved him away, muttering under her breath. As I walked past her table, I felt her eyes burning into me. For years, I had bent under that gaze, convinced I was small. But now, standing tall, I realized something simple: she couldn't touch me anymore. Outside the courthouse, the September air was crisp. Reporters lingered at the steps, but I ignored them. I stood there for a long moment, letting the truth settle over me like sunlight breaking through clouds. For once, the silence inside me wasn't heavy. It was clean. The courthouse steps were quiet once the reporters and onlookers drifted away. The sun was lowering itself toward the horizon, painting the city in pale gold. I didn't feel the rush of triumph most people might expect. Instead, there was a soft weight settling over me, a strange mixture of relief and clarity. For years, I had carried a ledger in my mind, tallied with every favor, every meal, every sacrifice my aunt claimed she had made. Now the ledger had disappeared, and in its place was something unquantifiable: freedom. When I walked into my apartment later that evening, the familiar smells greeted me: burnt coffee, old wood, a faint trace of lavender from a candle my mother used to love. I sank into the worn sofa, letting my body finally relax after the tension of the day. I picked up my mother's photograph from the desk. Her eyes, smiling gently through the glass, seemed to say what the judge had affirmed: "You were always worth more than anyone claimed." I whispered, "I did it, Mom. I told the truth." Her letter, once yellowed and fragile, lay beside me. I read it again. Love is not a ledger. Nobody owes for it, nobody collects. Those words no longer felt like a distant hope, they were the guiding principle I would carry forward. The days that followed were simple. I cleaned the apartment, filed away the remaining court documents, and finally slept through a night without nightmares of spreadsheets or invoices. I resumed my studies with a lighter heart, each page I read no longer weighed down by memories of a debt that never existed. At work in the law clinic, I found myself helping other clients with more focus, more patience, more clarity. The injustice I had endured became a quiet fuel, proof that I could stand against lies without turning to anger or vengeance. I discovered that strength isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. Sometimes, it's the calm persistence of truth, carefully and patiently revealed. I reached out to my cousin Julia, the one who had stayed silent during the trial. Over tea in a small cafe, I simply said, "The truth came out." She nodded, relief in her eyes, and for the first time, our shared past felt lighter, no longer tethered to Catherine's ledger of claims. The bonds I thought had been damaged beyond repair weren't perfect, but they were real. And that was enough. One weekend, I drove out to the lakeside where my mother used to take me in summers past. The wind rustled through the reeds, the water reflecting the muted light of early afternoon. I sat on the old dock, feet dangling above the water, and let myself breathe. I imagined her beside me, brushing back my hair, smiling. "You're my reason," she had said once, and I felt it again, deep in my chest. The truth of my mother's love was what had guided me, not invoices, not threats, not public claims. I stayed there a long time, watching the sunlight break across the surface of the lake, thinking about how small victories sometimes feel larger when they are quiet, unannounced, and deeply earned. The court had granted me more than just legal vindication. It had returned to me the narrative of my own life. I was no longer a child calculated and tallied in someone else's ledger. I was someone who could hold the truth in her hands, look at it steadily, and know her worth without apology. I rose from the dock, the breeze tugging gently at my hair, and walked back toward the car. My steps were unhurried, steady, grounded. I had reclaimed my history, and in doing so, had reclaimed myself. I often think about the ledger, the one my aunt tried to write for me, line by line, dollar by dollar. For years, it shaped how I saw myself, how I measured my worth. But the courtroom, the documents, the gavel, they didn't just erase her claims. What erased them was something quieter, something stronger, the truth that had always lived inside me, the legacy of my mother's love. She never measured me. She never counted my value. Even in her absence, her words guided me: love is not a ledger. That idea became my compass, a light I carried through sleepless nights and the quiet dread of injustice. Now, when I wake in the early morning, I still smell the faint lavender of candles, hear the city hum, and feel the rhythm of my own heartbeat. It's steady, unbent by someone else's calculations. I walk through the streets, enter my apartment, organize my files, not because anyone expects it, but because I choose to live fully in my own story. The victory wasn't loud. There was no parade, no dramatic applause. There was only the settling of my chest, the release of a burden I hadn't realized I'd carried for so long. I had reclaimed my history, my dignity, my freedom, and that reclamation has a quiet power that outshines any ledger, any invoice, any claim. I think of my mother when I see sunlight breaking through the clouds, casting gold across the lake, glinting like truth itself. She is with me in every careful decision, in every moment I choose clarity over fear, patience over anger, integrity over false narratives. And I know this, the future is mine to write, not someone else's accounting. I am the sum of my choices, my courage, my memories, and my love. I walk forward with quiet confidence, no longer shrinking, no longer counted, no longer owing. The ledger is gone. The love remains. And in that love, I am free.